ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that Wiley had never meant to change anyone's life, much less shatter the delicate balance holding an entire family together. But the moment the little boy whispered that he had once seen Chase holding Daddy's key, the world around him seemed to tilt. What began as an innocent memory suddenly became a detonator, igniting a chain reaction that no one, not even Chase himself, could outrun anymore. The truth had been hovering in the air for weeks, a shadow trailing behind every move Chase made. But it was Wiley's quiet confession that finally solidified suspicion into certainty. When Brooklyn froze, unable to mask the shock in her eyes, Wiley mistook her silence for fear of the police taking his father away. He clung to her side, unaware that he had just confirmed the exact detail investigators had been circling around. The one thread capable of unraveling Chase's entire career and pushing him toward the edge of ruin. From that moment, nothing could be dismissed as coincidence anymore. Chase had crossed the line the day he stole Michael's keychain, telling himself it was a necessary step toward justice. A righteous act meant to expose the man he was convinced had shot Drew. But now, with Wiley's recollection placed under the harsh light of unfolding events, Chase's motives no longer appeared noble. They looked deliberate, calculated, and unforgivably reckless. The key was no longer just an object. It had become a symbol of betrayal and obsession. Evidence of a man spiraling so deep into vengeance that he could no longer recognize the boundary separating truth from delusion. Even if he hadn't planted Drew's house key on Michael's ring, his actions had blurred the ethical line so thoroughly that he could no longer claim innocence. The fallout began immediately. Brooklyn felt at first the pressure tightening in her chest. The realization that her husband's actions were not just misguided but potentially criminal. She wanted to defend him, to believe Chase had acted under unbearable emotional strain. But Wiley's clarity left no space for reinterpretation. The child had spoken without hesitation, describing exactly how Chase bent down, picked up Michael's keychain, examined it, and placed it back again. The detail was too precise, too untainted by adult bias, and too damning to ignore. Brooklyn could almost feel the shift happening in real time. The narrative tilting from suspicion to inevitability as she processed what Wiley had unknowingly confirmed. Across town, the PCPD had already begun reevaluating timelines and testimonies, struggling to understand how the supposedly clean-cut detective had become entangled in the very kind of misconduct he once condemned. Every step Chase took to clear Willow had, in hindsight, become a step deeper into corruption. His choices now read like a confession written in behavior instead of words. The department had believed he fabricated evidence. Wiley's statement now validated those fears. What had once been speculation had turned into something far more dangerous: proof of intent. And once intent was established, there was no telling how far internal affairs would go to uncover what else Chase might be hiding. The most devastating part was that Chase had never expected the storm to break this way. He had prepared himself for accusations from colleagues, criticism from Dante, to even anger from Brooklyn, but he had never prepared for the truth to come from the soft, trembling voice of a little boy who adored him. Wiley's innocence made everything sharper, more unforgiving. A child had no reason to lie, no political motive, no emotional agenda. His truth was pure, and purity carried a weight no adult testimony ever could. Rumors began swirling around Port Charles as quickly as wildfire, feeding the growing perception that Chase was no longer the hero detective but a man unraveling under the weight of his own compromises. His future, once steady and full of promise, now trembled on the brink of collapse. Would he lose his badge? Almost certainly. Would he lose his marriage? That was becoming more likely by the hour. Every action he had taken to punish Michael now ricocheted back toward him with brutal precision, exposing the darker impulses he had tried so hard to ignore. His desire for justice had mutated into something raw and destructive. A need to rewrite the past, rather than face the pain of losing Drew. Brooklyn stood in the middle of it all, torn between loyalty and conscience, between protecting the man she loved and acknowledging the growing truth that Chase had allowed vengeance to consume. She could already imagine the moment when the police would come knocking, when Chase would realize the investigation had shifted decisively against him. And she knew Wiley's revelation would be the cornerstone of that shift, the undeniable element that transformed suspicion into certainty. Her heart ached at the thought of it, but she also knew that silence would only prolong the inevitable. Once Wiley had spoken, there was no turning back. The story had rewritten itself, and Chase's future now rested on quicksand. The tragedy was that Chase had not meant to become the villain of his own narrative. He had acted out of grief, desperation, and a misguided sense of duty, but intentions no longer mattered. The truth had surfaced, and the truth demanded consequence. Even before the formal investigation concluded, Port Charles could already feel the tremors of a man's downfall. The revelation did more than confirm a crime. It shattered the illusion that Chase was unbreakable. It exposed vulnerability and darkness where once there had been integrity. And now, with Wiley's confession echoing like a bell that could never be unrung, Chase's world began to crumble. Piece by devastating piece. Brooklyn found herself standing at the center of a storm she never asked for, a storm forming from secrets, half-truths, and the unbearable tension between loyalty and justice. She didn't want to see Michael dragged away in handcuffs, not when she had watched him fight for his family. Not when she understood how devastating prison would be for Wiley and the rest of the Corinthos children. But speaking up, saying the one thing that could help clear Michael, meant pointing directly at Chase, her husband, the man she had promised to stand beside through every battle. It meant betraying him at the deepest level, exposing him to consequences she feared he would never recover from. And those consequences were shattering. If the truth came out, Chase wouldn't just be disciplined. He would lose everything he had built at the PCPD. His career, his reputation. In the respect he carried as a detective, all of it would collapse the moment. Internal affairs connected the dots. After all, Chase was the one who planted the idea of checking Michael's keychain in Nathan's mind. He was the one who set the wheels of suspicion turning, even if Willow was the one who physically planted Drew's house key on the ring. Intent mattered. Timing mattered. And optics mattered even more. Once the truth surfaced, Chase would look guilty, calculated, and dangerously close to fabricating evidence. Even if that wasn't the full story. His anger toward Michael had blinded him. His desperation to clear Willow had pushed him into darker, more reckless decisions. In chasing justice for Drew, he had stepped so far outside the lines that the PCPD already believed he had crossed them deliberately. They suspected him of evidence tampering, and if Brooklyn breathed a word of what Wiley had confessed, that suspicion would harden into something permanent. Reporting the incident wouldn't save Michael, it would destroy Chase. The pressure crushed her from both sides. Their marriage, once a refuge, now felt like a fragile shell, one confession away from shattering. Even if Wiley had shared what he saw with someone else, the strain would still fall on her. But the knowledge that she and only she could expose Chase made the burden almost unbearable. If she turned him in, she would become the accelerant that burned through whatever trust still remained between them and possibly send their ID in. Marriage spiraling toward separation far sooner than either of them was ready to face. Brooklyn loved Chase deeply. She loved Michael too, but differently, fiercely, protectively. Like the cousin who had always been part of her foundation. And she loved Wiley most of all, the little boy who now unknowingly held power over the fate of 3 adults. She could not lie to herself, secrets only made everything worse. Covering for Chase would not save him. It would drag them both further into the quicksand forming beneath their quicksand. Marriage. So the question tortured her. After hearing Wiley's confession, would she go straight to Dante, hoping he could find a path forward that did not destroy both men, or would she confront Chase first, giving him the chance to explain, to confess, to step back from the chaos he had helped unleash? Either choice felt like betrayal. Either choice carried consequences that could change the course of her life and their future forever. The storyline forming around Brooklyn now was not simply about a detective losing control or a cousin wrongly accused. It was about a woman forced to choose between honesty and devotion, between protecting the truth and protecting her heart. And with every passing hour, the pressure grew heavier, sharpening the reality that the next words she spoke, whether to Dante or to Chase, would trigger a chain reaction. No one in Port Charles could stop. The moment Willow's crime was finally confirmed, the entire landscape of the investigation shifted with a violent jolt. As if every lie she had whispered and every calculated move she had made had suddenly snapped into place. What once felt like speculation now stood as undeniable truth. A truth so sharp it sliced through the last threads holding these families together. The revelation created a new form of control over everyone involved, a tightening grip of consequences that none of them could escape. It wasn't just about the planted key anymore. It was about the manipulation, the betrayal, and the deliberate attempt to frame Michael for a crime he never committed. For Brooklyn, the shock was devastating. She had always sensed turbulence beneath the surface of this custody battle, but never imagined Willow could be the architect of something so cruel and calculated. It shattered her worldview, cracked her trust in ways she didn't know how to repair. Worse than that, it forced her to reevaluate everything Chase had done in the name of protecting Willow. Suddenly, his anger, his obsession, and his reckless choices no longer looked like misguided loyalty. They looked like a man willingly aligning himself with a lie, choosing a path that had no moral ground left to stand on. The betrayal wasn't singular. It spread like poison through every part of her life. Brooklyn felt herself losing faith not just in Willow but in love itself. How could she trust a husband who had gone this far, who had risked everything, who had allowed his judgment to be swallowed by someone else's darkness? The man she thought she knew, the principled detective, the protector, the one who stood for what was right, was now a man she barely recognized. His choices had bound him to Willow's guilt, and when her crime surfaced, it dragged him down with it. And Chase. Chase lost everything in the fallout. The career he had built, the respect he had earned, the marriage he had believed was strong enough to withstand anything. Each piece broke apart with brutal clarity. Willow's exposure did not save him. It condemned him. It made every action he had taken look like collusion, like corruption, like he had been part of a conspiracy rather than a misguided attempt at justice. The department no longer viewed him as a detective who made a mistake, they saw him as a liability. Someone who had compromised an entire case. The stain on his reputation was permanent. What hurt Chase the most wasn't the badge he lost, nor the career he could never reclaim. It was the look in Brook Lynn's eyes when the truth came out. The disbelief, the heartbreak, the silent acknowledgement that she no longer knew who he was. Her trust and love, their love was gone, eroded by the weight of everything he had refused to see. And in her silence and the distance she put between them, Chase finally understood the price of the loyalty he had given to the wrong person. Willow's crime had been exposed. The investigation had entered a new phase of control, one that none of them could manipulate or soften. And in the wreckage left behind, Chase stood as the man who had lost the most, not because he was guilty of the act itself, but because he had tied his fate to someone who was. Brook Lynn no longer knew if love could survive something like this. And Chase no longer knew who he was without the life he had destroyed with his own hands.